The United States of America declared independence from Great Britain on July 4, 1776. In 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, its war for independence officially ended in victory. What were the world's reactions to this new country stepping foot onto the world stage? Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. Let's find out. Starting with France, the French had welcomed the insurrection against Britain from the beginning, and began secretly sending supplies to the Americans as early as 1776. Once it was clear that the rebels were able to endure a war and potentially even win, France openly established an alliance with America, which caused the British to declare war on them as well. The French then began to provide further support, such as weapons, ammunition, uniforms, etc., and sent forces to engage the British directly on land and sea alongside the Patriots, thanks in part to the diplomacy of men like Benjamin Franklin, who spent the war as a diplomat in France, advocating for the American cause. France, which was at the time under the rule of a monarch whose power was much more absolute than Britain's king, was not drawn to the American cause by anything like its revolutionary ideals. Rather, liberating the United States was simply seen as a strategically wise move. France was, at this time, in a fierce global competition with Britain. They had been defeated in North America in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, a decade prior, which allowed Britain to claim many of their lands there, putting France at a disadvantage. American independence would check British power. As such, both the French government and people tended to be very supportive of the endeavor. Briefly, they even considered invading Britain itself. While fighting in America raged, the French engaged the British elsewhere at the same time, such as the Caribbean and India. Furthermore, they would convince other powers to join the American side. French support was so crucial that argument could be made that without their assistance, Americans today could very well be speaking English instead of American. Thankfully, the Continental Congress did not have to worry about defending their online use from malware, phishing, password attacks, and other threats like these like we have to. But if they did, they would have sought the assistance of today's video partner, NordVPN. By going to nordvpn.com/fireoflearning, you can access the tools to help you confront these threats and remain safe while using the internet. For example, should you find yourself the lucky 1 millionth visitor to a website and click to download your prize to be awarded with malware designed to infect your computer and steal your data, well, NordVPN, whose threat protection scans downloads for malware, would come to the rescue and would have even warned you about dangerous websites before this point. And that's far from all NordVPN does. Another benefit it offers is the ability to hide your location by connecting to servers in other nations, which is useful for example, accessing movies and television unavailable in your country. By purchasing a 2-year plan using our exclusive link, nordvpn.com/fireoflearning, found in the description, you will receive an extra 4 months added onto your plan free. If you aren't satisfied with the product, NordVPN offers a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. So go to nordvpn.com/fireoflearning to learn more and get your risk-free plan today. The link can be found in the description. Like France, Spain had also begun to secretly help arm and fund the American rebels in an effort to check British power in 1776. In 1779, they declared war on the British. Although their battles primarily took place outside the 13 colonies, Spanish victories, such as the Siege of Pensacola and their successful reconquest of West Florida in general, were still highly beneficial to the American side as they distracted and weakened the British. After the war, the Spanish King Carlos III remained in personal correspondence with George Washington and was even noted to have given him a gift of livestock. Still, as Stanley Payne discussed in his book, A History of Spain and Portugal, Spain had intervened more as an ally of France and enemy of Britain than as an ally of America, and Carlos did have his concerns about the new nation. Spain controlled a massive amount of land in the Americas, stretching from the south of South America all the way to the Louisiana Territory that bordered the new United States. He feared that one day, the United States could pose a threat to Spanish holdings in the Americas. He also feared that the independence of one European colony in the Americas would set an unwelcome precedent for Spain's many colonies there. Both of these fears were realized in the following century. Portugal was not active in the conflict. They had an age-old alliance with Britain, but remained neutral throughout the war, as they had little reason to join, and were not even encouraged by Britain to join. If they had, it would have likely sparked a conflict with Spain, with whom they had just fought an unsuccessful war from 1776 to 77. Britain reinforcing Portugal would have unnecessarily complicated the conflict for them, especially given that, as Payne also mentioned, the Portuguese navy had been neglected and their treasury empty. Russia and its Empress Catherine remained officially neutral. Though Russia was a colonial power in North America, the fact that it was not especially expansive there and approached it from the opposite side meant it was not generally involved in the colonial conflicts of the Americas. However, they were more interested in the conflict than one might expect. There were a number of notable Russian elites in this time who expressed their approval and even admiration for the American Revolution. According to Nikolai N. Bolkhovetinov in his paper The Declaration of Independence, A View from Russia, the Empress herself blamed the British for the upheaval and felt it might even be advantageous for Russia if British power were checked by the independence of their colonies. She followed news of the war closely throughout its duration. The British actually made multiple requests to hire Russian troops for the war in America. At one point, they even offered Russia the island of Minorca in the Mediterranean if they pledged to join the war on the British side against the French, or at least pressure them out of the war. Catherine, of course, declined these offers. Overall, Russia's main influence in the American War of Independence came from organizing the First League of Armed Neutrality in 1780. During the war, the British frequently stopped and searched the ships of neutral nations for French contraband. At times, the British even seized the ships permanently, or kidnapped their sailors and forced them to serve in the British Navy, called impressment. British interference with their trade outraged the Russians. Thus, Russia led the way in establishing this league, which many neutral nations would end up joining to attempt to force an end to these practices and assert the right of neutral nations to trade with whomever they wished. But while there may have been quiet approval among the Russian elite of the colony's separation from Britain, it is important to note that, overall, the Russians strongly avoided taking a side in the conflict and did not directly support the Americans in any way. They even rejected American efforts at diplomacy until peace came with Britain to avoid irritating the British too much. Every choice Catherine made, regardless of which side it benefited, was done for Russia's sake. It is also worth noting that American ideals themselves were not well received in Russia. Works like the Declaration of Independence, for example, were partially, if not fully, censored there in many circumstances, as they were deemed too radical. This also occurred in other nations, such as our next country, Austria. Austria, one of two major German powers and a member of the League of Armed Neutrality, was neutral, having little cause to support either side. As is discussed in Jonathan Singerton's 2022 book, The American Revolution and the Habsburg Monarchy, American diplomats, called militia diplomats, arrived at various courts in Europe during the war uninvited, seeking to open up relations with various powers that could benefit America. In the Austrian capital of Vienna, William Lee arrived, seeking to establish relations, trade, and possibly even an alliance, hoping the Austrians could stop German troops from being recruited by the British and antagonize Hanover, ruled by the British king. The British, however, were also actively pushing to draw the Austrians onto their side, mainly against France rather than America itself. However, the Austrians still maintained a tenuous alliance with the French. Maria Theresa never officially granted American representatives an audience. Lee tagged along with a French diplomat to speak to Austrian officials, but they bluntly ignored him. In one incident, they arrived to speak with the Austrian Imperial Vice-Chancellor to find him in a meeting with the British. Unsurprisingly, there was apparently a lot of yelling. As Singerton noted, the Austrians were concerned about the potential effects of legitimizing a revolution against a legitimate monarch, lest they encourage the same thing in their own domains. Furthermore, Maria Theresa voiced concerns that the war could evolve into a much larger war, very much like the 7 Years' War, by European nations invoking their alliances. The potential trigger for such a war came with the War of Bavarian Succession between Austria and Prussia in 1778. This could have merged with the American War of Independence when the Austrians asked for French aid, but France was not interested in becoming involved militarily. French refusal to aid them against Prussia ensured that Austria would not aid the French against Britain. Therefore, while the Austrians kept a close eye on the conflict, they remained adamantly neutral, as there was no benefit to any other course. It is worth noting that, like in many countries, a majority of the Austrian nobility seemed to favor American independence, and were fascinated by it, as Singerton also describes. Prussia, the other main German power on the continent, and a member of the League of Armed Neutrality, also maintained neutrality throughout the conflict. However, as historian Paul Leland Haworth put it, quote, King Frederick entertained an intense hatred for England, and was consequently glad to see her humiliated, end quote. This hatred mainly stemmed from the 7 Years' War the decade prior, in which Frederick felt the British had abandoned Prussia. The king's preference for an American victory is clear in his private correspondence with his own ministers. However, this was purely because it would have slightly benefited Prussia. Overall, Frederick found no compelling reason to actively challenge Britain and support the Americans, opting mainly to be only a tranquil spectator, as he called himself. He became especially reluctant to poke Britain when Prussia went to war with Austria in 1778. He therefore waited before opening up anything like formal diplomacy or trade with the Americans until the war was over. Still, he and his officials maintained arm's-length correspondence with American diplomats. In one incident, the king briefly let slip information with the Americans about the possibility of Britain recruiting troops from surrounding nations. Perhaps most importantly, Haworth argued that had Prussia shown signs of taking the side of Britain against France were they to support the Americans, France may have been reluctant to do so to avoid a larger war on the continent. Frederick quietly suggesting the opposite, therefore, might have influenced the entire course of the war. Fascinatingly, after the war, there was quiet talk among Americans who were sympathetic to the idea of establishing an American monarchy of selecting a member of Prussia's royal family to reign over the United States as king, which we actually also made a video about. The link to that video will be in the description. The British were able to count on support from various other German states. They employed auxiliary forces from several of them, most famously from Hesse-Kassel, but others as well. It was, in fact, a common practice for some of the smaller German states of the Holy Roman Empire to raise armies for the purpose of loaning them to larger nations in exchange for compensation. The British often took advantage of this offer. These Germans had no personal motivation to join the war. They were simply hired by the British to do so. Regarding the Netherlands, from the outset of the conflict, Dutch merchants had been selling arms and munitions to the rebel forces and serving as middlemen for the secret French supplies. Still, the Dutch had previously held an alliance with Britain, and the British felt that they would ultimately take their side in the conflict. However, opinion among the Dutch was quite divided. Though the stadtholder, or leader, of the Netherlands was pro-British, many of the Dutch elite did not share his position, such as Johan Dirk, Baron van der Capellen-Totenpol, who was highly supportive of the Americans. It was also not lost on many Dutchmen that their former allies had usurped much of their dominance in commerce. In 1778, the British compelled the Dutch to join the war on their side, but the Dutch refused. That same year, the French joined the war. The British became especially concerned about Dutch trade with the French. To weaken France, the Dutch became a major target of Britain's efforts to seize and sometimes even take ships carrying supplies intended for their enemies. Tensions worsened. In 1779, the Dutch allowed the famous American captain who attacked the British in their own waters, John Paul Jones, to take refuge in the port of Texel. Their hesitancy in allowing the British to enter and seize him allowed him to escape, which infuriated Britain. In 1780, the British gained greater insight into the Netherlands' secret assistance to the Americans. The seizure of Dutch ships increased. This prompted the Dutch to join the League of Armed Neutrality, a move by which Britain felt threatened. They declared war on the Dutch that year, making it impossible for them to join a League of Neutral Nations, thus marking the beginning of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. The Dutch did not enter into a direct alliance with the French or Americans, but became more amiable to both and worked especially alongside the French. In 1782, American ambassador and future president John Adams secured the recognition of the United States from the Dutch. While nations like France and the Netherlands recognized the independence of the United States early on, the first foreign nation to recognize American independence was the Kingdom of Morocco in 1777. This may be surprising given that Morocco had no obvious reason to involve themselves in a distant British colonial rebellion. However, the American Revolution occurred during a period in which the Moroccan Sultan Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah was aggressively expanding trade with foreign nations. The Sultan had opened his ports to a great many nations with whom the Moroccans did not have official trade agreements. Among those they listed was the United States, with whom he attempted to establish an official treaty soon after. The United States, preoccupied with war, was slow to react. Once the war was over, the Sultan made it very clear he was determined to establish this trade agreement. In 1784, the Moroccans captured the American ship Betsy and its crew, promising to return the ship and release the prisoners only once a trade agreement had been struck, which one was in 1786. Across the sea and closer to the conflict, the responses of the various Native American tribes affected by the conflict were as varied as the Europeans. Most remained neutral, but a number of tribes fought in the war on each side. In some instances, different factions within the same tribes aligned with different sides. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, was divided over the issue. Most Iroquois nations sided with the British, while the Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the Americans. This Iroquoian Civil War ended a long-standing peace between the nations of the Confederacy. Another group, which were notably divided in the war, were the Cherokee. One of the grievances that the colonists had had with Britain was that in 1763, the Crown forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and ordered the colonists settled there to return east in order to end conflict with the indigenous tribes. As is discussed by the Museum of the American Revolution, native groups which feared that an independent America would alter or ignore this arrangement decided to align themselves with the British. Indeed, most tribes who joined were convinced by this argument, and thus the British had better luck in acquiring their assistance. Other native groups resented the British, however, and felt that an independent United States might be more willing to work with them, partly because of the friendships they had established with their immediate colonial neighbors. On the contrary, when the war was over, the Americans did indeed press westward into native lands, even those of their allies. Most other nations who paid attention to the conflict, including Sweden, Denmark, and the Ottoman Empire, remained neutral during the war and only opened up trade and relations with the Americans when they established peace with Britain. Their responses were similar to those which we have already discussed, with the Scandinavians being key players in the League of Armed Neutrality. The same is true of the various Italian states, though Singerton notes that Tuscany's Grand Duke at the time, the future Leopold II of Austria, was especially fascinated by the revolution's principles, enough to consider the implementation of similar ideas in his own lands. In summary, most of Europe's leaders regarded the notion of an uprising against what they deemed a legitimate monarch with concern, to the point of some countries censoring the radical ideas proclaimed by the American Revolution. Furthermore, many feared the potential for the conflict to spiral into a much larger one. However, in an age in which all the powers of Europe were in some form of competition with each other, it was an opportunity to check the power of the one which had recently been seeing the most success, and so most European leaders were at least quietly supportive of America's endeavors. Still, only those more directly threatened by British power became involved in the conflict. Regarding the revolution's ideals, while Europe's governments were quite disturbed by them, not all Europeans were opposed to them. Many people across Europe who were influenced by Enlightenment thinking were fascinated by the revolution and quite supportive of a new country seeking to experiment with and embody these ideas. Overall, a majority of continental Europe's upper classes seemed to sympathize with the American cause. In time, however, this sense of approval would flip during the chaos of the French Revolution. The challenging of traditional authority was deemed dangerous and radical, and thus the American Revolution came to be viewed in a different light for some time, with its ideas repressed further. As for the Native Americans, they were in direct competition with the colonists, and thus when they did become involved, it was largely on the British side, in the hopes that Britain would be less invasive, though this was not a universal stance, with some taking the American side. Beyond these regions, the revolution was mostly too distant of an event for people to have had a strong reaction. Finally, it is important to note that the American Revolution across the world is a huge and varied topic. This video was meant solely to summarize the primary responses of various different nations whose reactions are less well known. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning, and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. To support the channel, you may make a donation on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. A special thanks to our current supporters listed here. We also have a science channel much like this called Lucinox, so be sure to check that out too. Thank you for watching.